So, hello for the second time here from Forum Stadtpark. This is the final event in the framework of the Security Revisited lecture series. Our guests today are Andrew Herscher and Malkit Shoshan. I'm really very glad that they have decided to participate in the event. Our topic is fundamental security and mutual care on the design of refugee camps and emergency shelters. As this is the last lecture in the series, I will use the opportunity to make a very brief summary of what we have talked about so far and about the motivations and goals of this series. So as the majority of you already know, security is like this year's topic of Forum Stadtpark, and the majority of events, exhibitions, lectures, and so on are directly or indirectly dedicated to this topic. Whenever we have an event in English, it is always complicated to explain to English-speaking audience this complex German concept of Sicherheit, because it can be translated in English as both security, safety, or even as insurance. So it can mean many different things depending on the context. In any case, there have been two general observations that motivated this series. And the first observation is that the sensation of insecurity, of precarity, existential fears, and so on, are so much present in our societies that they concern nearly everyone in different places, independently of social contexts, even independently on class, even though how we experience this insecurity and what kind of insecurity and how it is framed depends on many different factors. And the second observation is that the concept of security has been very often instrumentalized on the part of conservative social forces in order to justify restrictive surveillance measures, migration politics, and so on. And because of this, as long as security has any meaning within left-wing or alternative discourses, it is mostly as object of critique. So there are, of course, good reasons for criticizing ways how concept of security has been instrumentalized. However, we think that this is not enough, and that we could appropriate this notion of security in more progressive ways, or that we can also deepen and broaden this critique that we respect very much. So that was actually our aim at the beginning, to deepen, to broaden, and also to challenge existing discourses on security. And we have tried to address many different topics or many different contexts where this security or security plays some role. And some of them were like in the context of care work. We had lecture of Manuela Zechner in the context of climate change with Lydia Kalipoliti and Friedrich von Borries, in the context of ecology with Alina Brad, in the context of speculation, specifically financial and future speculation, with Aris Komporozos Athanasiou and James Ogar, in the context of migration and housing and home violence with Gabu Heindl. And this is the final event with Andrew Herscher and Malkit Shoshan. So I'm very excited about it. I've forgotten to say that the series has been jointly organized by the section for social politics and the section for architecture at Forum Stadtpark, and where we have found a point of convergence between these two sections or two domains is our infrastructures. So when we talk about security or safety in context of social theory and political discourses, we mostly mean these immaterial networks or pillars that enable social cohesion and reproduction. And when architects talk about infrastructures, they mostly mean like these spatial and material elements that enable our livelihoods. And security plays an important role in both contexts that are also closely related. So now let me say a few more words about the specific topic of today's event. It is dedicated to the notions of security and care in the context of migration policy, humanitarian interventions, and the provision of emergency shelters. The questions to be addressed include: how is the discourse of security constructed in relation to forced migration? Whose security and what form of protection are actually at stake? How are refugee camps designed, maintained, and managed? Finally, what forms of spatial practice offer alternative approaches to the question of forced migration by promoting shared care and solidarity with and among the displaced? And also, one question that I guess Andrew will address in particular is if the notion of security and even the notion of care are sometimes used as substitute for a more important and more radical notion of rights. Let me now introduce Andrew Herscher, who is our first speaker. Andrew's work connects the study of architecture with struggles for rights, justice, and democracy across a range of global sites. His books include Violence Taking Place, The Architecture of the Kosovo Conflict from 2010, The Unreal Estate Guide to Detroit from 2012, Displacements, Architecture and Refugee, 2017, and The Global Shelter Imaginary, IKEA, Humanitarianism and Rightless Relief, co-authored with Daniel Bertrand Monk in 2021. Andrew is the co-founder and of a series of militant research collaboratives, including the We, the People of Detroit Community Research Collective, Detroit Resists, and the Settler Colonial City Project. He works at the University of Michigan. So, hello, Andrew. I'm very excited and very thankful and you can start with your input, which will take about 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to join you today. I'm very happy to contribute conversation on security and care. And I'm also delighted to be in dialogue with my dear friend, Malkit Shoshan, whose work is really an inspiration for me. Maybe I'll also add that I've been to Graz several times through work with the Institute of Contemporary Art there, and I wish it would have been possible to be with you in person. In any discussions sometimes have afterlives, and so if this discussion continues in real life, I would be very glad. I really appreciated the questions that Anna posed for us to questions that asked us to think about the concept of security in relationship to the spaces and the politics of displacement. And what I'd like to do in what follows is try to make 4 interrelated points as my response. And I'll share my screen with you now so I can augment my words with images. Sometimes they're only images of words, but hopefully they will be images that will help me share my thoughts with you nevertheless. I'm going to begin with obvious point. The point that many populations in the global north, led by their political representatives, often understand security in relationship to themselves when it comes to refugees and other displaced people. In other words, the security in question is security from refugees. The liberal response to attempts to securitize people from refugees is typically to shift attention to the security of refugees. And this is an attention that often focuses on innovations in the design of shelters, the design of camps, the design of other spaces for refugees and other displaced people. Now, these innovations might seem like obvious improvements to the challenging conditions that displaced people are forced to contend with. But I want to suggest that what's going on in these attempts to improve the security of refugees and other displaced people is actually a betrayal of their protection. It's a betrayal because those improvements take the place of the recognition of political rights. That is, the enhancement of a refugee's security, along with her dignity, her safety, her privacy, her self-reliance, and a whole host of other terms that are taken often of care, all of these practically function as a substitute for recognizing her rights, the rights that refugees with international law. And so I'll suggest that when it comes to insecurity, there is no substitute for the security that comes from the right to have rights, which is precisely the right that refugees functionally do not possess. And I want to suggest that the recognition of a refugee's right to have rights shifts the focus of political projects around refugees from inspiring compassion to making justice. This is a cosmopolitan justice, but it is not an emancipatory justice. It's not a justice that calls for a different world order. And so I want to conclude that the emancipatory political response to the insecurity of refugees and other displaced people is a response that does justice to the general insecurity of the global precariat, a population of people of which refugees and migrants are only the most visible members. And it's this recognition, this recognition of the rights of the global precariat that calls for new political forms, a new politics of care, and a transnational solidarity of the sort that I believe was gesturing toward in her introduction to this event. Before launching into these points, I will also mention that some of what follows is taken from two books, Displacements, Architecture, and Refugee, which I published in 2018, and The Global Shelter Imaginary, which I co-authored with Dan Mott in 2021. Now, anti-refugee and anti-immigrant politics are perhaps one of the most prominent commonalities between the contemporary United States and contemporary Europe, both spaces of enormous privilege in the planetary context. For some of those whose lives feel precarious in these spaces, the threats that they deal with from exploitive capitalism seem easily or even irresistibly transposed to supposedly threatening newcomers. And these are refugees and other displaced people, people who will supposedly take jobs from citizens, increase demands for housing that's already in short supply, make crime, spread disease, increase insecurity in all other ways as well. One scholar, Guy Standing, puts it like this: demonizing so-called illegal migrants has become part of the populist reaction to the insecurities visited on the precariat in general. Illegal migrants, rather than labor flexibility, policies, and shrinking social assistance, are blamed for the tribulations of local workers. And so the demand for security from refugees is subtended by racism, by nationalism, and all sorts of other expressions of intolerance. Now, the liberal response to racist and nationalist intolerance is to shift the discourse of security towards refugees themselves. So instead of demanding security from refugees, what's demanded is the security of refugees. And this latter demand has led to a great deal of attention paid to the design of shelters and camps. You're looking here at just a few of the many recent books that have been published on the topic of what's often called humanitarian design. Let's look a little bit more closely at one product of humanitarian design discourse, and this is the Better Shelter. It's a shelter for emergency housing that was authored collaboratively by the IKEA Foundation and the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. And if you read the description of the Better Shelter, you see that it promotes security along with privacy and familiarity as conditions that the Better Shelter intends to provide its inhabitants. And the Better Shelter does this, it provides these conditions by including such things as lockable doors, windows that can be opened and closed, and walls that are firm enough to provide a sense of enclosure. Now, on first glance, attempts to improve the security of refugees by such things as better shelters might seem like obvious improvements in the conditions that refugees are forced to contend with. If refugees and other displaced people are forced to live in shelters, why not design those shelters to provide as much security and safety and privacy and dignity and comfort as possible? The problem, however, is that efforts to provide refugees with decent housing and other forms of relief is that this relief provides a fake solution to a real problem. The real problem is not the conditions of refugee shelters and camps, the refusal of states to recognize the rights of refugees. And it is because states refuse to recognize those rights that refugees and other displaced people are forced into shelters and camps in the first place. This is something that Dan Monk and I wrote about in the Global Shelter Imaginary. And we put it like this. The creation of the International Refugee Organization in 1944, the establishment of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in 1950, and the passage of the 1951 Convention, states have advanced an international refugee protection regime premised on the universal right to seek asylum. But at the same time, Western states in particular have sought to preempt and delimit the exercise of that right in practice. And so the refugee has been suspended between the aspirations of international human rights norms on the one hand and the vicissitudes of domestic immigration policies on the other. And this suspension takes literal place in shelters and camps. Shelters and camps are the places where the contradiction between international refugee conventions, human rights norms, and domestic immigration policies is managed. It's managed by accommodating refugees and other displaced people in conditions of extended or sometimes even permanent impermanence. And so to focus attention on the design of shelters and camps is to translate a political form into a technocratic design problem, to substitute a mobilization of compassion for the practice of justice. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that this attention that's paid to humanitarian design is replacing the recognition of refugee rights with the provision of one or another form of rightless relief. The only real security that can be provided to refugees and displaced people, I would suggest, is to recognize their right to have rights. And in the case of refugees, these rights began to be codified in the 1951 United Nations Convention on the Status of the Refugee. And this convention guarantees that refugees possess the right not to be expelled from the state in which they take refuge, the right not to be punished for illegally entering the territory of the state in which they take refuge, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to public and public assistance, the right to freedom of religion, the right to access courts, the right of freedom of movement through the state in which they take refuge, and the right to be issued identity travel documents. And it's these rights, this constellation of rights I want to suggest, that provides security. It's not lockable doors and windows in temporary shelters. It's not temporary camps that have walls around them. It's not any other form of rightless humanitarian relief. Now, to recognize these rights would involve coming to terms with the contradiction I mentioned, the contradiction between the commitment that states have to international refugee conventions and human rights norms on the one hand, and state commitments to upholding sovereignty on the other. So coming to terms with this contradiction would mean letting go of state sovereignty in favor of a more cosmopolitan and just world order. What it wouldn't mean is opening up a space for emancipatory policies. And that space, I want to suggest, comes from the recognition that refugees and migrants and other displaced people are also the most visible members of the growing global precariat, the population of people around the world who live in existential and practical and pervasive insecurity. They live in insecurity because of their unstable capacity to support themselves and their families. And I think it's striking here that the rights that are refused to refugees mirror and anticipate the rights that are refused to other precarious populations in the states in which they reside. Refusals that prevent those people from obtaining social welfare, from obtaining political representation, from obtaining justice, from being able to live sustaining and sustainable lives. And this points to the fact that anti-refugee and anti-migrant politics are most relevant to precisely the people who have the most in common with refugees and migrants. These are precarious populations who feel the most threatened by the arrival of people who seem to live even more precariously. And it's revealing that the Precariat Charter and other people's charters are oriented around many of the same economic and social rights as the 1950 Refugee Convention. And so if we could approach issues of security not only around refugees and migrants, but also around all people living precarious lives, then we might be able to formulate a new politics of care, a politics that could build solidarity on the basis of shared precarities, a politics that would be defined by the needs and desires of precarious people, whether they are refugees or not. And this is a politics, I think, that would claim rights that are not yet recognized by any state or institution, a politics that might be truly adequate to the kind of security and care that we are gathered here tonight to discuss. Let me end here, and I look forward to talking with you more about this security and care and how we can work on their behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this input and for addressing the questions that are relevant for us in such a clear and concise way. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions related to your lecture, but now let me introduce our second speaker, Malkit Shoshan. Malkit is an architect, researcher, writer, founder of the architectural think tank FAST, which is an acronym for the Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory. And she's also a design critic at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Her work explores and highlights the relations between architecture, politics, and human rights. In 2016, she curated the Dutch pavilion for the Venice Architecture Biennale. Her publications include Atlas of the Conflict, Israel-Palestine from 2010, Village, One Land, Two Systems, and Platform Paradise, co-authored with Maurizio Bortolotti in 2014, and Blue, Architecture of UN Peacekeeping Missions from 2018. Hello, Malkit. Thank you very much for joining us, and let us hear your lecture. I'm very excited about it.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm just echoing Andrew. I'm very happy to and honored to be here in conversation with him because I'm also very inspired by his work. Let me try to put on a slideshow. Sorry, I have to fix it a bit. Do you see my window, my slideshow?
Yes, yes, we do.
Perfect. Okay, so I didn't prepare a structured presentation, but I will share several case studies because our work is at the intersection of design and activism, and we often work, most of our projects are taking place in conflict-affected urban and rural environments, spaces that are that have experienced actually perpetual violence, and security is intrinsically part of the production of space and everyday life in different ways. And so I will try to share several projects that I hope can at least show the way we as designers can observe and share and bring into visibility and into the surface some of these very, you call it precarious realities, but very complex and environments that actually stand almost as a testimony or evidence to the failure of our institutions of governance. Let me see. So I'll show several projects that we've been producing this past. As you mentioned, it's the Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory, and our work is at the intersection of design and activism, and we advocate with our projects, or our project advocates social and environmental justice. What we try to do with our work is to make visible systemic violence and to engage various publics and develop counter narratives and designs. And we use these counter narratives and design to influence systemic change by challenging institutions and power structure. And this is a very, I won't say it's a very difficult process. The change is extremely incremental, but I think the conversation is important, especially if we are to try to explore what kind of resources and we may be able to liberate from or, you know, like from these power structures. Like, for instance, you mentioned the book, but one of the, like on the slide, we have images from several events that we have organized at the UN headquarters in New York City. These are a series of high and expert level meetings, which are part of a long-term research and advocacy project that is called Blue, that explore the impact of UN missions on cities, communities, and the environment. And I won't enter to it too much. We just published the book. So the book was supposed to come out in 2018, but it just came out about a week ago. I received it from the printer, and I'm very curious to see the response to the book. And I'd like to use this presentation to actually share 3 projects that we've been working on in the past. The first project is Atlas of the Conflict, Israel-Palestine. The Atlas maps the appearance of Israel and the disappearance of Palestine over the past 100 years. And it presents more, we use more than 500 maps to provide a detailed territorial analysis of the conflict, which includes themes such as borders, patterns of and typologies of settlements, demography, land ownership, archaeology, and cultural heritage sites or landscaping, and access to natural resources. I can just briefly flip through the different chapters just to give an impression of it. And I will maybe share a couple of stories from the book. Over the past century, 2 major processes happened simultaneously: construction and destruction. What you see on the map is the distribution of Palestinian and Israeli localities over the territory, and the first sequence of maps show the distribution of localities in 1918, and the second pair of maps shows the distribution of localities in 2010. So you can see the transformation of the landscape in a relatively very short time, and the way the Palestinian localities have been erased from these areas and concentrated in the West Bank and in Gaza, mostly in refugee camps, and how it was taken over by new Israeli localities. During and just after the establishment of the state, more than 500 Palestinian villages has been destroyed. And in the typology chapter of the book, we look at, we kind of provide an overview of different typologies, formal and informal typologies. One of the first spread looks at the destroyed Palestinian villages that led to an international response, which was the first UN refugee camp. It emerged along the border of Israel to provide shelter to Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war. Already then, the newly established UN refugee agency, UNRWA, have confined more than 700,000 Palestinians in camps across the region. And more than half of the, for instance, the population in Gaza live in refugee camps still to this day, or they are the dependents of refugees from descendant of refugees from 1948. So borders are never purely local institutions, and I want to speak a little bit about borders because it's part of these institutions that we have adopted as society that divide the world and territory and create all these security regimes and security apparatus, or what at the end Balibar call the institutions of institutions. They are never you cannot reduct them to a simple history of conflict or an agreement between neighboring groups or and powers, but they are always globals, and they divide the world into regions that can be governed, managed, and controlled through that control territory, mobility, and people. And again, this is a quote of Balibar: "The border is an institution of institutions." And it's a non-democratic condition of democracy that is also fundamental governing instrument of the nation states and its sovereignty, that produce all these spaces of exception, like the refugee camps, or the spaces that suspend rights, right? Like as Andrew described it so precisely and clearly. So they are not so, it's, borders are both internal and external, or subjective and objective, imposed. They are imposed by state policy, and they again control over human mobility and relationships, and they are deeply rooted in collective identification and the assumption of a common sense of belonging. For example, and I'm constantly moving from in the images from Palestinian example case studies to Israeli case studies. So this example from the Atlas is the typology of states sponsored gated community. It shows the creation of a new master plan. It's called the 7-star master plans that demonstrate how borders can work as an institutions that or produce reality and institutionalize this production of reality and of life, of everyday life on different scales from the global to the local scale. This master plan was conceived in 1967, just after the 1967 war, and after Israel confiscated the West Bank, and it aimed to transform the demographic balance in this region. So it took place along a segment on the northern part of the Green Line. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And the Green Line is the internationally recognized border of Israel. And what you can see is that this fortification of the border through settlements was comprehensive, and it included the master plan included the creation of 7 cities and highways and national parks and industrial centers, etc. And at the same time, when this master plan took place to secure this old border and to change the demographic balance in this region, a wave of demolition orders were issued for the Palestinian localities that live in this region. At this intersection of borders, the nation state and global governance, we can speak also of the failure of these institutions. And within this context, I would like to mention a couple of projects that we've done about Gaza. And the first one, let me see. So for us, Gaza, or for us in general, Gaza can be considered as a place of exception where the conditions and the distinctions of normality and everyday life are normally suspended, including what Andrew mentioned earlier, the rights to have right, especially when considering the stateless, like the situation of stateless population. So this project is called ZU, or the letter Z just after Zionism. The project begins at the last page of the Atlas of the conflict, and it starts with the letter Z. Of the lexicon that includes 2 terms. The first one is Zionism, and the second one is ZU. Zionism stands or provide a brief description of the Zionist movement and its strive to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And the term ZU feature a news item and a postcard describing how Gazan zookeepers painted 2 white donkeys with black stripe and caged them in a zoo cage as zebras. When you think, I'll try to keep it brief, it's a longer story and the research is much broader than what I'll show here, but when you think about the term zoo and Zionism, or more precisely, the urban zoo and the nation state, both can be traced back to the age of reason or the beginning of modernity, and looking at the transformation of the donkey into a zebra, one rather quickly realized that something went terribly wrong here. So we spent about a year researching the Gaza Strip in the light of these 2 terms. and speculating about classification going wrong. We started producing illustrations that experiment with the notion of domesticity or domestication of wild species. We looked at crafts associated with the domestic space. And we began representing our images and diagram using embroidered and all sorts of soft models and macrame and weaves. And we drew imaginary of animals inspired by paintings from the Enlightenment era while replacing the background with elements borrowed from news items on the Gaza Strip. So we brought in the flotilla and the F-16 and the tunnels and the walls and the watchtowers. And those again replaced what used to be found in these paintings, like church towers and farmlands and etc. So we designed all sorts of cages, and we created a new sort of an archive that provided a dictionary or terms associated with the Gaza Strip. And we turned the architecture gallery into a menagerie. And we had some animals like part of the exhibition. It sounds really terrible, but we completely engaged with the notion of the paradox while trying to raise awareness to the daily life in Gaza. These are additional images. While working on this project, we also been in continuous contact with a family in Gaza that actually owned and managed this small zoo in Gaza City. And the zookeeper actually joined us in the opening of the exhibition. And we had a continuous conversation with them. So the idea of this work was, again, liberating some of the resources that are captured in Gaza. Gaza is under siege since 2007, and it's very hard to communicate and understand what is happening in this space. Elements of zoo and Gaza are also embedded in another project that we worked on. It's called Border Ecologies and the Gaza Strip. It's a project we proposed as an installation for the Venice Architecture Biennale. And again, it gave us some resources because most of the projects that we are working on are not really funded or have no institutional kind of home. So it allowed us to, again, reach out to the community in Gaza and try to see how they are doing and how their everyday life has been transformed, especially after the Trump administration that silenced the, let's say, like what is happening in Gaza and the COVID pandemic. So for this project, we worked with a family of farmers. And we explore the emergence of unexpected spaces in response to stresses and war. And for nearly a century, again, the fluctuation in the shape and form of the border have affected both human and natural ecology, leading to the formation of spaces of exception, environment that at times seems paradoxically more resilient and sustainable than those with steadier histories. So in the past decades, the 4-acre farm that we worked with was attacked, damaged, and destroyed time and again by Israeli raids, shelling, and patrols. The exhibition, and in the exhibition, we installed this exhibition and brought in these stories in Venice, but we also showed it later on in Amsterdam. We collected stories of everyday life from the farm through ongoing conversation with the Kudaya family. linking mundane objects, produce, and species such as watermelon, sardines, sands, and sediments to bureaucratic protocol, to the Israeli imposed restriction and continuous act of violence. These stories also attest to the family and the farmers community continual engagement in collective acts of survival, resistance, and mutual aid and solidarity. I won't enter to the stories because I don't think we have too much time, but there is some of the stories are described extensively in a website that we put up. It's called, you can find it under borderecologies.org. This speaks about water and wheat and wedding, how they use different spaces of harvest to create or alternate harvesting with communal festivities, and how they kind of cope with this daily reality of both war, but also this engagement with the soil and with the land and the constant production and reproduction of life, of food, of and all the everything that comes with that, with day-to-day life. And I can end with a video that we received from the farmers. I just deposit them next to each other, but the films were produced by a couple of farmers, and we managed to download them, and it was really hard. It wasn't easy to get access to these files, and it shows this kind of let's say this interwoven or the struggle to sustain life, sustain themselves on a day-to-day basis while also experiencing this constant stress along like one of the most militarized and securitized borders in the world. So I'll just play it. I hope, please let me know if you can hear it. You hear it? No?
No, we can see it, but we cannot hear it.
Let me try. I don't know what I need to do in order to have it. Let me see, stop share. Do I have a minute to try and fix it? Or?
Sorry, Malkit, you asked if we have time to, or
if I have a minute to try and fix the video.
Let me check. Okay, so you should click on share audio.
Search down. Yeah.
Can you help with this, Simon, or it's beyond your?
Let me see.
Okay, no.
Let me try it again. I'm here. I think it should work now.
Before you share the screen?
Tell me if you hear it now.
Yeah, now it's fine. Thank you.
Well, I think I can end here. I'm not sure if I answered straight to your question, gave a straight answer to your question, but I think most of our projects are in one way or another dealing with the question that you ask and trying to, bring them forward and bring them into a public space or a public sphere and create a conversation about you can say really about the failure of our institutions, and we don't have answers. I mean, the answer might be obvious, or like the rights to have rights is one of them, but the way to get there is it's extremely complex and seems to be hermetic.
Thank you very much, Malkit. I find this was really great to have your input after Andrew's, because after we learned from Andrew that making better shelters in the context of the so-called refugee crisis is not the best thing designers and architects can do. So we have seen from your projects what possible alternatives are. Before we proceed with the discussion, I would ask you just if you have a few slides or can say a few words about your project on UN peacekeeping missions, just in order to establish an even more direct connection to Andrew's Andrew's input. If you have something prepared, if not, it's not a problem.
No, but I do think, I mean, in Gaza and in the West Bank, you have the oldest refugee camps in the world. We look at them as temporary spaces, but those are permanent realities that people must inhabit because they don't have any other option, because they don't have the freedom of movement. They don't have access to jobs. They live for more than half a century dependent on external aids. So we speak about bare life. I mean, human makes life complex wherever they are, and especially if they are for a long time, as you see in these farms. But Gaza is a space of exception. It's like a camp. It's a prison, and I think there might be like a direct connection when you see how the camps evolved over time, right? So now we talk about the climate crisis, and we see the number of immigrants and climate refugees soaring, and it's just the beginning of something that is going to unfold in much bigger scale. And I think what we need to do as a society is really examine our institutions, because they don't work. So I think there is the link, and the work on the UN shows actually like how complex, like the complexity of bureaucracy and the legacy of, let's say, colonialism and old empires, they are still holding the fort. Like much of the decision and the budget and the people that work at the UN are sponsored through the peacekeeping department, and this peacekeeping department is managed and controlled. All the decisions are controlled by 5 powers, which is the US, America, China, Russia, and France. And each of these powers have the right to veto whatever decision they want. And it's in that sense, it's a very exclusive system that is not geared and not ready to address all the stresses that we will have to address as society because of the climate crisis.